How are we doing today, guys? So today we're going to be talking about lunges, specifically the barbell lunge. So this particular lunge that we're going to be talking about is going to be focused around the Olympic lifts in terms of staying more vertical with your shapes and keeping the knees, or the front knee specifically, back at a vertical shin angle, and also about shifting as much load as possible where you can utilize both legs. We're not talking about necessarily specifically talking about any particular type where you're getting the knee forwards or back or anything like that. It's more specific around positions and training strength in those positions to be able to catch heavy split jerks and things like that. Having said that, we will go through things at the end around the Bulgarian split squat and the front foot elevated, which will go into those sorts of shapes, but the positions that we're talking about are relevant in all of them. So how the video will go, we'll be talking about setup first, and we're going to be talking about how you start the position, but also how you finish the position. And then we'll be going through the movement, the cueing around the movement, and we'll talk quickly about back rack and front rack in terms of just how that affects the rib cage and how that's going to play into the hips. And then we'll talk about the other variations. There'll be timestamps on these down in the description, so you can jump to where you need to go to. So talking about a lunge, specifically about shifting load, but load in relevance to specifically the split jerk and the catch in the split jerk, is that we want to be getting to a 90-90 position. So we're going to talk about the bottom position first. When we get to a 90-90, the reason why we want to get here is because we want to stop the chin from moving forwards. When we're talking about a split jerk in particular, if that knee shifts forwards, all your body weight tracks forwards and the bar is going to come with you. So we want to be talking about deceleration mechanics. So how we drill this mostly is by doing a step forwards lunge. Now, obviously if you're doing acceleration based stuff or you're trying to work on sprint speed and things like that, reverse lunges are typically a lot better because they promote shin angle forwards and promote positive shin angle versus negative shin angle. So again, use the lunge that is relevant to you and what you're trying to do, and obviously your coach should give you the specific cues that you're looking for. However, the lunge positions are still the same in terms of hips and knees and all the rest of it. So, first thing we're going to target is coming into the feet. So when we're talking about feet, the feet give us the stability. So we want to be thinking about where they're positioned width-wise, but also how they're positioned length, but also how the foot itself interacts on the ground. So when we're talking about width, ideally we want to stay about hip width, stacking straight underneath. Now this is generally narrower than people think when they start under their hips, but it's also generally wider than what they think when they're out elongated. I'll explain. So when people start here, quite often they'll start wide because that makes them feel balanced and feel stable. From there they're going to step out and then they wind up in a tightrope sort of situation where the feet are almost in line with each other, so you've got lots of lack of stability. Now, reason for this is because they're starting wide. They start wide and they step across, and because they don't have the length in that wide position to be able to hit that shape. So starting actually narrower so that you are stacked, and by stacked I mean like the outside of your hip, foot lines up with the outside of your hip. It means that they can very easily shift forwards like they're on train tracks. So getting people to start narrower can generally be a very good thing to think about. So start narrow, straight under hips. From there, we want to be thinking about our feet. So when we're talking about feet, I'm talking about rotation. A lot of people will step out and they'll quite often have either straight foot, rotated out, or rotated in. And they'll do the same on their back foot, rotated out, straight, or rarely rotated in. So what we want to build here is stability. So if you stand out and you put your feet wide on both things, it's very unstable, very uncomfortable. I'm exaggerating that, but it's going to be very, very hard to lunge in that position. Straight foot position is fine, assuming that you control through the ankle. What a lot of people do when they go down into their lunge is that they'll buckle into pronation. Not that pronation's bad, pronation's quite good, and I'll explain later, but they'll buckle forwards and the knee will track inwards. We want to keep everything tracking straight. So the most stable position, particularly if we're talking about split jerk specifics, is actually rotating that foot just slightly in towards 1 o'clock and having the back foot straight or slightly rotated in. Again, this creates stability and actually allows the back knee to bend and creates hip flexion, which allows you to travel down, which is going to make it a lot easier and specifically trains the cat shapes we're talking about in our split jerk. So when you step out, try and think about starting the feet straight and step into it, keeping the feet straight or letting that front foot just toe in slightly. Gives you a lot more stability and allows you to rest on the outside of that foot, which is what makes it significantly better for deceleration and pulling the knee backwards. From there, we want to get down to the bottom position. So if I'm holding that shape position through the feet, I'm going to drop down to the bottom shape. Now from here, like I said, 90-90, basically we're talking about stacking the knee over the top of the ankle. From there, the back ankle is relaxed. We're not talking about having the back knee plantar flexed or pushing forwards, because if you lunge and with a stiff ankle, it's going to drive you into these forward positions, which is a lot less stable, particularly when we're talking about the barbell lunge. So relax that back ankle, sit into the 90-90 shape. From there, we're looking to stack the weight of the bar, whether that's back racked or front racked, over the hips, which is going to be over the back knee, and then from there, that's going to be our strongest position. We do want to try and ideally tap the back knee, or at very minimum get very close, and then from there we want to be thinking about trying to drive vertically with both legs, with both knees straightening up at the same time. This allows us to create a vertical bar path for the bar, which brings us into the hips. So the hips, for us to create a vertical path but also a stable path, but also make use of all our musculature, need to be thinking about staying square in terms of left to right as well as level. If we talk about square, what a lot of people will do is they'll step out and they'll rotate. When we're creating that rotation, again, it's more likely to rotate the back foot, it's more likely to put rotation through the torso and the bar, but it's also a lot significantly more likely to create instability, and you have to step across either way to balance yourself out. So we want to be thinking about creating a stable base. This typically means the hip needs to come forwards. So you may need to stretch out the front of the hip flexor on that back leg, and you may feel differences between sides. On top of that, we want to think about level. So when people come out, again, quite often, they'll try and come down, but they'll come down with their hip. Notice how my knee's not really doing that. My knee hasn't bended here, but I've dropped lower. It's because this side's dropping down. And what you'll see when you come down is you'll see the hip being pushed out to the side. We want to be thinking about creating a hip that is square, left to right, and level. So when you come out, move down. And that way you have to bend at this front hip and extend at this back hip and bend at both knees to allow yourself to travel down. So make sure you're creating those positions, because it'll make a significant difference to creating balance between the body and the stability, but it'll also mean that you'll train the adductors, the outside of the leg, as well as your quads, glutes, hammies, etc. Okay, so going into the movement. So if we're talking about the barbell lunge itself, obviously you'll back rack it or front rack it. We'll talk about that quickly in a second. From there, you want to be setting yourself up so you have space to step. From there, you're going to take a comfortable step out, remembering starting with your feet in underneath the hip. Comfortable step out. From that point, stop. If you've got a big load and you try and drop straight into that, you're going to move diagonally, because that load's going to keep pushing you forwards and you need to stop that weight. So drive the heel into the ground on the front foot to allow yourself to push back and create that stability. From there, travel down by bending that back knee and allowing yourself to travel vertically. From there, you're going to tap that back knee on the ground and drive vertically upwards with both legs before obviously repeating that rep, repeating that movement, or stepping back and switching sides, depending on how many rep ranges you're doing, etc. So those are the cues that we want to be thinking about. Now, back rack and front rack. Biggest thing when we're talking about stabilization, particularly if we're trying to tie this into the Olympic lifts, is that you want to make sure the rib cage stays underneath the center of mass. So if you're back racked, you want to be thinking about flexing, and then from there, tucking in and holding that position as you move into that rep to drive back. If you're thinking about a front rack, you're obviously going to hold the rib cage down so that the ribs stay in contact with the hips, but from there you're going to create a slight thoracic extension so you can sit slightly taller. From there you're going to drive into protraction, elevate that elbow up. From there you're going to hold that shape as you move to then tap and shift backwards. So depends on your what position you're holding that bar in to allow you to move. So I'll quickly demonstrate both so you can just quickly see the shapes, and then we'll talk into lunge variations. So if I'm back racking first, pull myself into the back squat sort of shape. From there, I'm going to flex the upper back, pull the tailbone back to neutralize the spine. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to give myself space to be able to step into, lining the feet underneath my hips. From there, I'm going to take a comfortable step forwards. From there, I'm going to stop so that I can get myself balanced and stop that weight. From there, I'm going to make sure that I'm flexed. I'm going to move down, tap the knee, drive straight back up as I move. Then I'm going to step back. Now if I switch that to a front rack, from there the elbows are going to stay forwards. I'm going to step forwards with my other leg this time around. I'm protracted, I'm pushing those elbows towards the wall in front of me. From there, hips are still stacked underneath, ribcage is still down, thoracic extension is happening. I'm going to step forwards, again comfortably. From there, stop and wait. Bend that back knee, tap the ground, drive back up with both legs. A step back to lock out. Now, people will have differences between legs. That's normal. In my case, my left leg backwards feels less comfortable, which is related to an old injury. So it can be something like that, which is an old injury. It can be simply a weakness in terms of the person feels more comfortable in one position than the other. Can be related to tightnesses, etc., things like that. So when we're talking about differences, it's not a big deal what the difference is in terms of whether or not it's left leg or right leg. However, knowing what it is important. If you can figure that out and create as much evenness as comfortable, there's probably always going to be a difference, and that's okay, that's fine. We're asymmetrical beings by nature, so what we want to be able to do is just create comfort in both sides, even if they do feel a little bit different strength-wise. Okay, we're going to dive into a little bit more depth on some of the other lunge variations. So we have front foot elevated lunge and the Bulgarian split squat. All the cues that we've talked about with the lunge are still relevant here. The racking would be the same. Obviously, if you're holding dumbbells or kettlebells, that's slightly different, but we won't talk about that today. So a Bulgarian split squat is where the rear foot is elevated up on something. Now, quite often, people tend to use objects that are too high, and they may actually need to drop down something low, particularly if you're shorter. I can get down to position on a bench to be able to tap that back knee down with full range of motion for myself. By the same token, if you're not that tall, then that won't work. So a good indicator is generally where your shin is. If your knee isn't comfortably above that height, then you probably shouldn't be using that. Again, it does come down to personal mobility as well. So, Bulgarian split squat, there are two main variations that people will use. One is a knee dominant pattern, where the knee will track forwards, and you're going to be the torso will travel down. And there's a second variation, which is training the front leg specifically for something like this, where the shin stays vertical and the torso and hips actually move backwards. So I'll demonstrate both movements so you can see what's happening with the torso position and also my foot position. So everything else stays the same. Foot, you should be thinking about keeping that foot straight forwards, etc. One thing I will say slightly different here, because we're going to knee dominant versus hip dominant, is pronation of the foot. So by that I mean, if your front foot, supination, we're talking about pressure on the outside, pronation, we're talking about pressure through the inside of the foot, or the flattening of the foot. What we're looking for, if you want to create more dorsiflexion or knee forwards action, is the ability to pronate, to push pressure into the inside of the foot. If you put pressure on the inside of the foot, it's going to allow you to track forward significantly more. This doesn't mean the knee comes in, you collapse inwards. What it's saying is that we want that foot to close down, get closer to the ground, to allow for more range of motion through the ankle, to allow you to actually get further knee forwards and put more pressure through the quad, which is actually quite a beneficial movement when we're talking about vertical acceleration for things like jumping and things like that. It's actually a very important role there. And the knee should be able to track over the toes. That is a good thing, not a negative thing. So when I set this up, again, hips stay square and level. I'm going to go knee dominant first. I'm going to keep the toe close to the edge of the bench. From that point, I'm going to be looking to create a vertical descent. So my toe is on the bench. Some people might find this uncomfortable, in which case you may need to put your toe up. If you're going to put the toe up though, you probably need a lower object, because you're not going to be able to reach the ground with this one. So if I've got the toe down, from that point there, hips are square, hips are level, I'm still going to stack. From that point, my knee is going to track forwards over the top of that toe. I'm going to tap onto the ground, and then I'm going to drive straight back up. Notice how the ribs and hips stay stacked the entire time. And I move as far forward as I feel I can before that heel comes off the ground, and I drive vertically back upwards. And this is going to really isolate through the quad and the glute to really create knee and hip extension. From there, if I go to a hip dominant pattern, I'm going to step out further. My shin here is going to stay vertical. Now, instead of me creating pronation here, I'm going to be looking at creating supination. Because supination is a deceleration mechanic in terms of it allows you to jam your foot in. That's why basketballers, when they jump in, you'll see them put their toe in, so the shin is less likely to travel forwards. It just creates a bit of a jam. And that's fine, that's what we want. So in this case, I'm going to be putting pressure through the outside of the foot. That doesn't mean that my big toe is not on the ground. My big toe is 100% still on the ground. I'm still trying to press through that point. From there, I'm going to travel backwards with my torso and hips. Everything else stays the same. Level, and I travel back, tap the knee, and drive straight back up. Now from there, again, the ribs and hips stay stacked, the shin stays vertical, and I drive vertically back upwards. You should feel a lot more hamstring glute through this position. Again, different mechanics for different situations. That's our Bulgarian split squat. Other variation that we have is a front foot elevated lunge. These are very, very useful for, again, deceleration mechanics, but can also be very good for training ankles and also deeper hip ranges of motion, etc. And you can also do these by having the heel elevated off the ground, or if you go forwards and having the toes elevated, which can be quite beneficial for foot strength, ankle strength, and generally just creating a bit more stability up and down the chain. So if I'm doing a front foot elevated lunge, everything else stays the same. Again, we can drive different mechanics. If I step backwards and drop down, I'm driving in a much deeper hip position, whereas if I drive over the top of the knee, it's going to be becoming a lot more knee dominant. I'm going to be getting to much deeper positions through that knee and the ankle. Again, all the other cues stay exactly the same. You'd be thinking about the pronation there. You'd be thinking about the supination with the the knee staying back. It's all about what's happening through the foot and what's happening through that knee. That's our lunge for today, guys. If you have any more questions, feel free to message me. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed it.